Strange woman adopts a disabled cat. The truth behind it moves everyone. Before we begin today's story, ask yourself, what if the key to a woman's locked-away life was hidden in the damaged body of a creature everyone else overlooked? You think you know what happens when a strange woman adopts a disabled cat, but the truth of their intertwined pasts is a revelation that will shatter your assumptions and warm your soul. Stay with us, subscribe, and like this channel to hear their incredible journey. The wail of an ambulance siren, distant at first, then closer, tore through the artificial silence of the penthouse apartment where Eleanor Vance had imprisoned herself. It wasn't the sound itself that triggered the panic. It was the sudden noise that followed, a loud thud, as if something heavy had fallen from the balcony upstairs directly above her. Eleanor's body froze, her breath caught in her chest. The room began to tilt, the walls seemingly pressing in, suffocating her. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. No, not now. She stumbled towards the bathroom, eyes squeezed shut, trying to visualize the familiar path. This was her fortress, her safe haven. Everything had to be in its place. Everything had to be predictable. That sound, it was like a body falling. Like that fateful night, Eleanor tripped on the edge of the Persian rug, nearly falling. She clung to the wall, her fingers clawing at the elaborate floral wallpaper. Panic surged like a dark tide, drowning her reason. She couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, frantic as a trapped bird. She had to regain control. Had to. She mumbled numbers, a grounding technique her therapist had taught her years ago before she'd given up on all attempts. 1, 2, 3, the blue armchair. 4, 5, 6, the seascape painting. But the image of that man, his eyes wide and lifeless, the blood, no, she couldn't. She slid to the floor, her back against the cold wall, knees drawn to her chest. She buried her face there, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to erupt. The outside world was a menace. The sounds, the people, the unpredictable chaos. This was why she couldn't leave. This was why her door was always locked, her curtains always drawn. The ambulance siren receded, but the echo of that horrific thud lingered in the air in her mind. Eleanor, curled up on the floor, trembling and alone, a prisoner in her own home, haunted by ghosts. Only she could see the safety she had so painstakingly built was so fragile, so easily shattered by an unexpected noise, a cruel reminder of the world she had tried so desperately to flee. She didn't know how long she lay there, only that when the last of the tremors finally subsided, the room was dark and a cold, hollow emptiness enveloped her once more. Just a few years prior, Eleanor Vance had been the epitome of calm and competence. As a seasoned ER nurse at Boston City General Hospital, she was accustomed to handling the most chaotic situations with a cool head and a steady hand. She could insert an IV in the dark, read a complex EKG in a heartbeat, and most importantly, offer comfort to frightened and hurting patients. Colleagues respected her. Patients adored her. Eleanor loved her job, the sense of purpose, the fact that she could make a real difference in people's lives. But then one damp October night changed everything. A gang-related altercation had turned her emergency room into a war zone. Shouts, curses, and then gunfire. A stray bullet. Eleanor remembered screaming, remembered the overwhelming helplessness as she watched her close colleague David crumple to the floor, blood blooming from a wound in his chest. She'd tried to save him, performing Cipanoa desperate while chaos still erupted around them, but it was too late. The image of David's vacant eyes, the sudden silence after the gunshot, the smell of cordite and blood, it all seared itself into her mind, a scar that would never heal. The diagnosis was severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Eleanor tried to return to work, but every alarm bell, every loud noise, every pained face dragged her back to that horrific moment. The panic attacks started more frequent, more intense. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The world outside, once the stage for her compassion and skill, now felt like a minefield of triggers. Eventually, she had no choice but to resign. She moved to a quiet apartment building in a different neighborhood, hoping a change of scenery would help. But the seclusion gradually became a prison. She cut off contact with most of her old friends and colleagues, too ashamed, too tired to explain. Her home became her only refuge, a tightly controlled space where everything was orderly and predictable. The curtains were always drawn, calls went unanswered, and trips outside were limited to grocery runs at the quietest hours. She became the strange woman in the penthouse, a ghost in her own life. The inciting incident arrived in the form of a note slipped under her door. It was from Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor downstairs. Mrs. Gable was one of Eleanor's few tenuous connections to the outside world. Occasionally, she'd leave a small bag of groceries at Eleanor's door, or a few flowers from her small balcony garden, never demanding a direct thank you. This time, Mrs. Gable's shaky handwriting told of an emergency. She'd been hospitalized suddenly and had no one to look after Marmalade, the cat she'd just adopted from a shelter. Knowing Eleanor had been a nurse, she asked with a gentle urgency if Eleanor could possibly care for Marmalade for just a day or two. Eleanor read the note over and over, her heart pounding. A cat, a living, unpredictable creature in her carefully controlled space. The thought was terrifying. Every instinct screamed, no. But then an image flashed. Mrs. Gable's kind, wrinkled face, the loneliness in her eyes when they'd accidentally met in the elevator months ago, and a faint flicker of her old self, the nurse who cared for others, stirred a pang of guilt and something akin to responsibility. Just a day or two, she told herself she could do that. It was just a cat. She took a deep breath and for the first time in months felt a small, albeit frightening sense of purpose pulling her out of her shell. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Mrs. Gable's number written at the bottom of the note. That small decision was an irrevocable step into unknown territory, a move that would shake the foundations of the world she had so painfully constructed. Marmalade arrived in a battered carrier brought by Mrs. Gable's hurried nephew, who deposited it on Eleanor's living room floor with a perfunctory thanks and a swift departure, clearly uncomfortable in the apartment's still dim atmosphere. When the door clicked shut, Eleanor and the new occupant of her home faced each other in a heavy silence. Through the bars of the carrier, Eleanor could see a huddle of orange fur cowering in the furthest corner. Gingerly, she unlatched the door. Nothing happened. "Hello there," she whispered, her voice sounding foreign, even to herself after so much disuse. She backed away, giving the cat space. After what felt like an eternity, a small, timid head emerged. Marmalade was indeed a pitiful sight. One eye was clouded over, obviously blind. His small face was crisscrossed with old scars, and one ear was tattered. The cat's entire body trembled a slight but constant tremor, and he moved with a pained vigilance, each step uncertain. It was clear the little creature had suffered greatly. Marmalade's arrival instantly shattered the fragile equilibrium of Eleanor's world. He was terrified of everything. The slightest noise in the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, a creak of the floorboards, sent him bolting for cover, usually under the sofa or behind the curtains. Eleanor's initial attempts to coax him out were fruitless. She left food and water nearby, but they remained untouched for hours. Eleanor found herself in a quandary. Her first instinct, honed from years in the ER, was to assess control fix. But Marmalade wasn't a patient to be soothed with rational words or medical procedures. He was a bundle of traumatized nerves. A sense of helplessness, sickeningly familiar, began to creep in. She started to wonder if she'd made a mistake agreeing to this. Yet something about the small, trembling creature resonated with a hidden part of Eleanor. Perhaps it was his visible brokenness, a reflection of her own. Instead of giving up a sliver of her old nursing instinct surfaced, she found herself online researching how to care for partially blind cats with a history of abuse. She read about the importance of patience, of creating a predictable and safe environment, of using a soft voice and avoiding sudden movements. She began to apply what she learned. She spoke to Marmalade in a low, gentle monotone, telling him about her day, about the books she was reading, just to get him used to the sound of her voice. She moved slowly around the apartment, announcing her approach. She placed additional bowls of food and water in various spots, hoping he would find them when he felt safe enough to emerge. The first few days passed in a state of tension. Marmalade remained mostly hidden, emerging only when Eleanor wasn't around. But then, small changes began. One morning, Eleanor woke to find the food dish empty. Another time, while she was reading in her chair, she caught a glimpse of Marmalade slinking across the room, his one good eye warily on her, before he disappeared behind an armchair. A new complication arrived in the form of Mr. Henderson, the officious building manager, a man with a fondness for rules and regulations. He'd heard a rumor about Eleanor's new pet and came knocking with a thick binder of building bylaws. "Ms. Vance," he said in a self-important tone, "it has come to my attention that you are harboring an animal in your apartment. Do you have the proper permits? And the building has strict rules regarding noise and sanitation." Eleanor, who hadn't faced such a direct confrontation in years, felt a familiar wave of panic rise. But as she glanced towards the shadows under the sofa, where she knew Marmalade was listening, an unexpected protectiveness overrode her own fear. "I am temporarily caring for Mrs. Gable's cat," she replied, her voice a little shaky but firm. "She is in the hospital." Mr. Henderson looked displeased, but retreated for the time being, promising to monitor the situation. This external pressure added another layer of stress for Eleanor. Not only did she have to worry about caring for a traumatized animal, but she also had to deal with the potential threat of being forced to give him up. One afternoon, as Eleanor was trying to lure Marmalade out from his hiding spot with a small piece of tuna, he suddenly cried out in pain and began to convulse. His usual tremor intensified, and he collapsed onto the floor legs, twitching. Eleanor froze for a moment, memories of seizure emergencies at the hospital flooding back, but then her trained instincts took over. She gently turned Marmalade onto his side to prevent choking, clearing away nearby objects that could be dangerous. The seizure lasted only a minute, but to Eleanor, It felt like an eternity. When Marmalade finally lay still, exhausted, but through the worst of it, Eleanor felt her own heart stop. She had to call a vet. The thought of letting another stranger into her safe space of dealing with a medical situation she didn't fully control was terrifying. But looking at Marmalade's pathetic state, she knew she had no choice. The mobile vet, a young woman named Dr. Ramirez, was professional and kind. She examined Marmalade, gently explaining that the seizure could be related to an old head trauma or extreme stress. She prescribed some medication and gave Eleanor instructions on monitoring him. Dr. Ramirez's presence, initially anxiety-inducing, had an unexpected effect. It forced Eleanor to interact, to explain, to act as a responsible caregiver. In the following days, Eleanor focused entirely on Marmalade's care. She administered his medication, monitored his symptoms closely. She began to neglect her own rigid routines, the precisely timed meals, the silent hours of reading. Instead, her time was dictated by Marmalade's needs. It was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Slowly, a subtle shift occurred. Marmalade began to trust her. He no longer bolted million the moment she entered a room. Sometimes, if she sat quietly, he would creep closer, sniffing her ankles cautiously. And then one evening, as Eleanor was reading, she felt a light touch on her hand. It was Marmalade rubbing his head against her fingers, and for the first time, Eleanor heard a tiny rhythmic sound. His faint purr. A warmth spread through Eleanor's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. It wasn't just relief, it was a connection. Just then the phone rang. It was the hospital. Mrs. Gable had taken a turn for the worse. They weren't sure she would make it. And then the nurse on the other end of the line relayed Mrs. Gable's dying wish. She wanted Eleanor to keep Marmalade permanently. The news of Mrs. Gable's critical condition struck Eleanor with unexpected force. Though their relationship had been one of fleeting interactions, Mrs. Gable had been a kind, silent presence in Eleanor's lonely existence. And now, her dying wish for Eleanor to officially adopt Marmalade left Eleanor feeling a weight of responsibility and a profound sense of being moved. A few days later, Mrs. Gable's lawyer contacted Eleanor. Mrs. Gable had passed away peacefully. In her will, along with a small sum of money to cover cat care expenses, Mrs. Gable had left a personal letter for Eleanor. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Mrs. Gable's handwriting, though faint, still conveyed warmth and wisdom. She wrote that she had observed Eleanor from afar for months, noticing the hidden sadness behind her distant demeanor. Mrs. Gable, too, had experienced loss and understood how devastating loneliness could be. When she found Marmalade at the shelter, a little creature also bearing the scars of its past, she had felt a connection. She believed that these two broken souls, Eleanor and Marmalade, could find healing in each other. The last part of the letter was what truly stunned Eleanor. Mrs. Gable revealed that she had learned Marmalade's story from the shelter volunteers. The cat had been rescued from a horrific abuse situation where he had not only been starved and beaten, but had also witnessed other acts of violence. This detail, though vague, resonated deeply with Eleanor. It was a painful reminder of the chaos and violence she had witnessed, the kind of violence that had shattered her own life. Mrs. Gable believed that caring for a creature who had endured similar horrors might help Eleanor confront her own demons. Eleanor sat in stunned silence. The letter crumpled in her hand. Tears streamed down her face. The grief of losing Mrs. Gable mingled with the emotion of the trust she had placed in her and a profound empathy for Marmalade. Now the cat wasn't just a temporary responsibility. He was a legacy, a link to the kindness of a woman who had seen something in her that she herself had forgotten. The thought of returning Marmalade to a shelter, especially after knowing more about his past, was unbearable. This tiny, trembling cat had begun to trust her. She had seen glimmers of life in his one good eye. How could she abandon him now? The decision was made in that moment of stark realization. She would keep Marmalade. She would fight for him. And maybe, just maybe in the process, she would fight for herself too. This was no longer about passively reacting to circumstances. This was an active choice, a declaration that she would not let fear dictate her life anymore. She thought of Mr. Henderson and his threats about building regulations. Previously, the thought of confronting him would have paralyzed her with fear, but now a new fire of determination had been lit. She would not let some petty bureaucrat take away her only companion, take away this chance at healing. Eleanor stood up feeling a strength she hadn't felt in a very long time. She walked to the phone, found the number for Mrs. Gable's lawyer. "I will adopt Marmalade," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and I need to know all the necessary paperwork. Perhaps you could also advise me on the building's pet regulations." The turning point had arrived. Eleanor Vance, the woman who had hidden from the world, was now preparing to face it. Her goal was no longer mere survival. It was to protect Marmalade, to build a life for them both. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. Beside her, from under the couch, a soft purr rumbled, a quiet affirmation. She was no longer reacting to the world. She was beginning to act. The point of no return had been crossed. The decision to keep Marmalade breathed new life into Eleanor, but it also ushered in a host of new challenges. The first and most pressing was dealing with Mr. Henderson and the building management. Eleanor spent hours online meticulously researching the HOA Homeowners Association bylaws. To her surprise, she discovered that while there were stipulations regarding pet size and noise, there was no outright ban on cats, especially one as small, quiet, and well cared for as Marmalade. It seemed Mr. Henderson had either deliberately misinterpreted the rules or had a personal agenda. Eleanor began to carefully gather her documentations. She took photos of Marmalade sleeping peacefully, chronicled their gentle interactions. She obtained a letter from Dr. Ramirez confirming Marmalade's health status, his need for a stable environment, and the fact that he posed no sanitation or noise threat. This process forced Eleanor to do things she had avoided for years: make phone calls, arrange appointments, even step outside her apartment to visit Mrs. Gable's lawyer's office to sign the official adoption papers. Each small foray into the outside world was a struggle, but the thought of protecting Marmalade gave her an unexpected strength. In parallel, Eleanor worked tirelessly to help Marmalade overcome his fear and anxiety. She created a safe space for him in a corner of the living room, complete with his soft bed favorite toys and one of her old sweaters for a familiar scent. She learned to read the subtle cues in Marmalade's body language, a twitch of an ear, a tensing of his body, and adjusted her behavior accordingly. They developed their own language and unspoken understanding. Marmalade's presence, with his constant needs and his reliance on her, forced Eleanor to live in the present moment rather than being lost in her traumatic memories. She began to open the curtains a crack during the day, allowing soft sunlight to filter into the apartment. Marmalade was initially skittish, but gradually he began to enjoy the warm patches of sun. Eleanor even bought a few small potted plants, an attempt to bring a little bit of the outside world in. However, the path wasn't smooth. Mr. Henderson, undeterred by Eleanor's initial silence, escalated his complaints. One afternoon, Eleanor received a formal letter from the management stating she was in violation of building bylaws and demanding she resolve the pet issue within 10 days or face disciplinary action, including fines. The letter hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The panic she had fought so hard to suppress returned with terrifying force. She sank to the floor, gasping for breath, feeling the walls close in on her again. "I can't do this. I'm too weak, too broken. How can I fight an entire management board? I can barely take care of myself, let alone protect another creature." The thought of having to give up Marmalade, of sending him back to a strange place, was agonizing. She felt like a failure. It was Eleanor's dark night of the soul. She wept despair, overwhelming her. She almost picked up the phone to call the shelter to surrender, but as she looked down, she saw Marmalade tentatively approaching. The cat, still trembling, rubbed against her ankle, and then with a surprising effort, hopped onto the sofa beside her, curling up close to where she sat. He had never done that before. That small act, the silent trust and comfort from a creature equally scarred, pierced through Eleanor's fog of despair. She looked at Marmalade, and in his one clear eye she saw not fear, but a quiet resilience. And she remembered Mrs. Gable's words, her belief that they could heal each other. No, she would not give up. She owed it to Mrs. Gable, she owed it to Marmalade, and she owed it to herself to fight with renewed determination. Eleanor wiped her tears. She recalled what she'd read about animal advocacy groups. She searched online and found a local organization that specialized in legal advice for pet owners having trouble with HOAs. She took a deep breath and called them. The woman on the other end was sympathetic and offered a wealth of helpful advice. She even offered to help Eleanor prepare for a formal hearing with the board. If it came to that, Eleanor also did something she never thought she would do. She reached out to an old colleague from the hospital, Sarah, a nurse she had once been quite close to. Recounting her story, even via email, was incredibly difficult. But Sarah responded with warmth and support, without judgment. It gave Eleanor a small measure of strength. In the following days, Eleanor threw herself into preparing for the potential confrontation. She drafted a detailed response letter to the management, attaching all her supporting documents. She practiced what she would say, trying to keep her voice calm and coherent. The HOA board meeting was set for the end of the following week. The tension mounted, but this time Eleanor wasn't alone. She had Marmalade by her side, the remote support of the animal advocacy group, and an old friend. And most importantly, she had a clear purpose. The HOA board meeting room was stuffy and formal. Mr. Henderson sat at the head of the long table, a smug expression on his face. A few other board members sat around, looking tired and generally uninterested. Eleanor walked in, heart-pounding, a folder of documents clutched in her hand. She felt the curious eyes of a few other residents who were also present, perhaps invited by Mr. Henderson to add pressure. Mr. Henderson began the hearing with a lengthy speech about the importance of maintaining community standards and property values. He painted Eleanor as eccentric, unstable, and her cat as a potential nuisance, a danger to hygiene and the building's tranquility. He presented grainy, long-distance photos which Eleanor suspected he had surreptitiously taken of her drawn curtains and her stressed appearance on her rare outings. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, her throat was dry. She took a deep breath, remembering Sarah's words of encouragement and the image of Marmalade waiting for her at home. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice a little shaky, but gaining strength as she continued, "I am here today to talk about Marmalade, my cat." She didn't just defend her right to own a cat. She told her story, not in graphic detail about that horrific night, but enough for everyone to understand the pain and trauma she had endured, the PTSD that had led to her reclusive life. She spoke of how she had once been a nurse, a caregiver, and how her illness had stolen that from her. Then she spoke of Marmalade, of how he too was a victim, a creature who had suffered unimaginable cruelty. She read a portion of Mrs. Gable's letter, sharing the kind neighbor's dying wish that these two broken souls would find each other. She described the patience she had shown Marmalade, the small milestones they had achieved together, and how this little cat, with his simple needs and his slowly dawning trust, had begun to pull her out of the darkness. "Marmalade is not a nuisance," Eleanor said, her voice now filled with emotion, but strong. "He is in therapy. He is a friend. He is a reminder that even after the worst traumas, healing is possible." She presented the vet's letter, the photos of Marmalade, and pointed out that there was no evidence of him causing any problems whatsoever. To the building, silence filled the room as Eleanor finished. Her raw honesty and vulnerability had shifted the atmosphere. Mr. Henderson looked flustered. A few board members exchanged uncertain glances. Suddenly, a voice spoke up from among the attending residents. It was Mrs. Peterson from the third floor. "I'd like to say something," she said. "I've lived in this building for 10 years. I remember Miss Vance when she first moved in. She was always very private, but for the past few weeks, I've seen her walking a small cat in the courtyard very early in the morning. She looks more peaceful, and the cat is very well behaved." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the residence. Apparently, Mrs. Gable hadn't been the only one to notice a change in Eleanor. After a brief, tense deliberation, the board voted. The result: Eleanor was allowed to keep Marmalade provided she adhered to the general rules of hygiene and noise, which she was already doing. A wave of relief washed over Eleanor, so potent she almost had to grip the table to stay upright. Mr. Henderson muttered something under his breath, clearly deflated. As the meeting adjourned, a few neighbors approached Eleanor, not with morbid curiosity, but with genuine words of support. Mrs. Peterson even invited her for tea. Eleanor, though still a bit overwhelmed, smiled and politely accepted a small but significant step. Returning to her apartment, Eleanor felt exhausted, but also filled with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't known in years. Marmalade greeted her at the door, rubbing against her legs, as he always did. She scooped him up, burying her face in his soft fur. "We did it, little guy," she whispered. "We did it." In the days and weeks that followed, a new, healthier normal began to take shape. Eleanor was no longer a complete recluse. She started taking Sarah's calls more regularly. She even considered joining an online PTSD support group Sarah had recommended. She still had bad days, moments of anxiety, but they no longer controlled her. Marmalade thrived under her care. His tremors lessened, and he became more confident, exploring the apartment with the curiosity of a normal cat. He was still blind in one eye and bore the scars of his past, but now his good eye shone with a calm peace. Eleanor began volunteering remotely for the animal advocacy group that had helped her, using her nursing knowledge to advise others struggling with sick or abused pets. It was a way for her to reconnect with her old profession in a new, less stressful way. Her apartment was no longer a fortress against the world. The curtains were often partially drawn, letting in the sunlight. Occasionally, Eleanor's soft laughter could be heard as she played with Marmalade. The strange woman in the penthouse hadn't disappeared entirely, but she was seen understood, and the story of her bond with the disabled orange cat had truly moved those who learned of it, a testament to the power of compassion and the incredible healing capacity of the human-animal bond. Life still held its challenges, but now Eleanor Vance didn't face them alone. She had Marmalade, and she had a new, quiet hope.